Hello, and welcome to our second full week of class. The two stories that we are starting the week with today are pretty horrific, but William Faulkner is a Nobel Prize winning author, and Erskine Caldwell is also a very well known Southern agrarianist writer, or someone who writes about the agrarian South, meaning the rural farming South. So, I wanted to give you some details and facts about lynching, and this is from the University of Missouri Kansas City Law School. There are various reports that you can find online about lynching. And as you can see, they have listed earlier in Reconstruction more white people being lynched than black people. But starting around 1890, which we call the nadir, the lowest point of race relations in the United States, the numbers start to shift, and there are far fewer white people lynched and many more black people, especially when we consider the differences in percentage of population that white and black constitute. So in 1931, which is the year that Faulkner published Dry September, there was one lynching of a white person and 12 lynchings of black people. This is important because the details about lynching are often understood as white men becoming irate because a black man allegedly attacked a white woman. As you see in the Caldwell story, the lynching takes place simply for challenging the power and supremacy of a white man. And this report gives several details about lynching, but this is from the Equal Justice League. It also there are some lynching photographs here, and I find them very traumatic to look at, and I don't want to make people look at them. So, at one point in this report, they say, and this is often a commonly held argument, that one of the main reasons for lynching, in addition to the importance of white supremacy, is that there was a fear of interracial marriage, and that white men were fearful that black men would try to marry white women, and there was a fear of black sexuality. So that is an argument that comes from studying the newspapers and the reports from white supremacist culture. Instead, if we look at the NAACP records, the story is quite different. The NAACP carefully studied and explained the details of every lynching that happened in the United States, and I have read those NAACP records. Overwhelmingly, the black people who were lynched were property owners, and were lynched because they were an economic threat to the white community. And if we think about events like the Wilmington riot in 1898, or the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, all of those white terrorist attacks that murdered black people that apparently aren't included in the lynching data were because those black communities had created their own hospitals, stores, insurance companies, you name it, that there was economic self-sufficiency. So I think if we looked at the numbers of white attacks on communities of black people rather than just the NAACP's records of white supremacists attacking black farmers and landowners, it becomes pretty clear that this stereotype of black sexuality is really an excuse and a terrible myth, what Angela Davis calls the myth of the black rapist, whereas the overwhelming cause for white supremacy is, in fact, a fear of black economic advancement, social equality, and progress. So we see black people lynched on the accusation of rape and murder, supposedly this fear of black sexuality. I'm just going to call BS on that, because when you look at the NAACP records, you find out that lynchings actually took place because people owned land, owned businesses, were economically successful. And that is not the case in these two stories by white people. These are the lynchings by year. So they have 5 white people and 59 white people for 1921. Hundreds of people died in Tulsa. So they're obviously not including attacks on Rosewood, Wilmington, Tulsa, and the other white supremacist attacks that took place. If we go to our stories and our quiz, I think it's interesting to look at the transition that takes place in the quiz between the story of Minnie Cooper and the story of Lonnie, who is unable to, even though he much admires this black man, who is unable to help him. Kind of like the barber in the second story. So Clem Henry stands up to Arch, and that is a little bit more of a realistic depiction, I think, of the reasons for lynching. So the switch, though, that happens between the two stories is on question 15. How does this story depict the relationship between the races? Power imbalance and the oppression of black individuals. Is that question about the Faulkner story or about the Caldwell story? Because here we go into the Caldwell story. The previous question was about the Faulkner story. The question also of Minnie and whether she regrets her past is quite interesting, but there are very subtle clues about class in the Faulkner story that don't come forward immediately as evidence that this is a class-based attack in some ways. First of all, Minnie was very popular as a young woman, but then when she came closer to marriage age, she finds that her friends were starting to learn the pleasure of snobbery male and retaliation female. Then she hears her schoolmates talking about her. She lives in a small frame house with her mother and her aunt. She's not of the debutante echelon, that upper echelon of society, but she tries to run with them when she is younger. And because she is not, quote, good enough for those more elite Southerners, she ends up alone and unmarried. Something else that I found very strange in the story about Minnie is that she always buys these new dresses. She is very, very interested in her looks and going out and being seen still. And she's getting a lot of attention for having made this claim. So she didn't get attention for maybe 20 years of her life. But in her fresh dress, she's trembling, but people are looking at her, the one in pink in the middle. And then the lifted hats of gentlemen, voices deaf and protective, and then they notice that all of the black people in the town have disappeared. So she has a breakdown after telling this tremendous lie. It seems, if we look carefully, just to get attention, and perhaps her laughing and carrying on is just something of a breakdown for what she's done. The other very slight reference to class is McClendon, one of the main culprits, persecutors, returns to his neat new house, trim and fresh as a bird cage and almost as small. So we see in this case that McClendon is not a wealthy man. He's a veteran, but a humble man. He doesn't live in an estate. His house is probably even smaller than Minnie's, but the fight to gain status has a lot to do with economics. If we look at some of these subtle clues in the story, then he beats his wife because she stayed up too late, and that's kind of who we're dealing with. So as you look at these stories, think about the hints and the clues that you'll see that are things having to do with class, economics, wealth, and not just these supposed stereotypes about sexuality, which again are myths and possibly continue to be dangerous today. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week.